All right, welcome back, grade 10s. We are going to, before our mass break, talk about the A1 because that's tomorrow. Then after the mass break, we'll talk about the A2 because that's on Wednesday. And then we will finish up by looking at the multiple choice after the lunch break because that's on Thursday. So, I've already given you a pretty big hint that the set of sources for our A1 tomorrow will be based on the case study of India. So I would recommend going back to lesson 12, Historical Globalization India, and looking at the content behind that case study, but also looking at some of the sources within the document itself. The main thing that we need to do to get ready for our A1, aside from being somewhat familiar with India, is to be familiar with the process. So it really is a 4-step process, the A1, that we need you to write 4 separate paragraphs. We need you to write a paragraph for each of the sources and a paragraph for the relationships. So there will be 3 sources there tomorrow, and each one of those sources needs to get its own paragraph. And in the paragraph, are you okay? Yeah, you just look like you're gonna fall. Okay. Each of the paragraphs needs to get its own paragraph. Or sorry, each of the sources needs to get its own paragraph. So that's the first step. And tomorrow we're gonna have the entire day just for that one assignment, right? The entire day just for the A1. So you may want to subdivide your time. We have an actual break between 8:50 and the mass break. So in that time you should be able to get through at least one of the 3 sources. Maybe 2 of them you'll get to interpret them. And then you'll want to interpret the 3rd source before lunch. And then that'll give you some time after lunch for the relationship paragraph. Please keep in mind that the relationship paragraph is worth 30% of the assignment. So if you're going to spend more time on any paragraph, maybe it should be the relationship paragraph. So for each paragraph, each source, you're meant to find an ideological perspective. So when you submit your assignment to me, for each one of your sources, each one of your first 3 paragraphs, I should be able to do a Control F and find the term ideological perspective in that paragraph. Maybe multiple times. If it's a quote, like this quote that we're seeing as the first quote on the document itself, if it's a quote like that, then I would suggest to you that the steps should be that you look at the quote as a holistic thing first. So big picture, read through it once, and then make some general statements about it as one piece. So as one piece, what's the theme? As one piece, how does it connect to some of the language of the course? How does it connect to globalization, right? We need to connect each source to globalization. That's the theme of the course. And then you can talk about the topic, and the topic's going to be India and British imperialism in India. So any studying of that case study will certainly help you out. But then, if it's a quote, I would say go through it line by line, phrase by phrase, big rocks by big rocks, and unpack the language of the source. So when it says historical globalization was a difficult process for many indigenous people around the world, first term that I see that it's a big rock might be historical globalization. So what time period does that refer to? Historical globalization begins with Columbus's exploration in 1492. What are some of the forces that drove historical globalization? Gold, God, and glory. So I might use that information to unpack this section. And because of the term there, that really tells me the context of this source. That tells me the time period that the source is referring to. Historical globalization was a difficult process for many indigenous people around the world. So it says around the world, but we can infer that it's talking about North America, it's talking about South America, it's talking about Central America, it's talking about the Caribbean. It's talking about Africa and it's talking about Asia. So even though it says around the world, we can add to the language of the source and say that when it says around the world, we can infer that it's mentioning these places. And with regards to those places, we can mention how it was difficult. So when it says it was difficult for the Indigenous peoples of Canada, an example of that would be, the word difficult is an understatement here, would be for the Beothuk or the Beothuk people of Newfoundland. It was more than difficult. It led to their ultimate demise. There are no Beothuk or Beothuk people left. But the main focus here is India. The natives of India call British imperialism the knife of sugar. It is all smooth and sweet, but it is the knife notwithstanding. So we're going to need to know what that means. We're going to need to know what the knife of sugar means. So, how would imperialism be like a knife? How is it a weapon that inflicts damage? A knife is a weapon that inflicts damage. A knife is a personal weapon. It's not a sniper rifle, where somebody can kill you from 1,000 yards. A knife is a very personal weapon. Imperialism is very personal. It's inflicting personal damage. So when I think of imperialism as a knife, I'm remembering the movie Gandhi, and some of the elders that met with Gandhi and talked about their poverty that they were living in, and the hopelessness and despair that they were living in, because of the absentee landlords, because they were forced to grow indigo, because they were forced to pay taxes, because they didn't have enough food to eat, that they were starving, that starvation, that poverty was personal. There's nothing more personal than poverty. It's another quote by Gandhi. There's nothing more personal than poverty, and a knife is a very personal way to inflict damage. A knife someone. So if imperialism's a knife, they could have picked anything. They picked a knife. The knife of sugar. What's the significance of knife there? What's the significance of sugar? Sugar is addictive. You're becoming addicted to a weapon that's being used against you. How is imperialism in India addictive? Sugar is that hidden drug, right? If I came in here today and offered you cocaine or heroin, you might say, no, Mr. McBride, I don't do drugs. But if I offered you sugar, you'd be like, hey, thanks. The sugar is this hidden drug. So it's important that it's saying sugar. The knife of sugar, this personal weapon, a knife of sugar, this hidden drug. A drug that we become addicted to, that our bodies literally crave, and that when we don't have sugar, we go through withdrawal. So for some of the Indian people, they create a dependence on imperialism. It changes them, as sugar changes us at a biochemical level. It is all smooth and sweet, but it's still the knife notwithstanding. The British forced many peoples into the modern world. And yada, yada, yada. The quote will continue. So if there is a quote like this, it's your job in those paragraphs, the interpretation of source paragraphs, to get into the language. Break down the significance of the language. So in order to get to a PF, which is sound and specific, you need to get past generally this is about imperialism in India being both good and bad. To get to a sound and specific, you need to be like, you know what, they're using the word knife because imperialism is a very personal attack. For example, that's becoming more sound and specific. And the more depth you can get into, then you can become a little more insightful and comprehensive. So, you might see a source similar to that on your set of sources tomorrow. And if this is a long quote like that, break down the language of the quote. You may also see a cartoon. So there's lots of great cartoons connected to this case study. And this 31-page document about imperialism in India is full of cartoons. So I might, as a student preparing for tomorrow's A1, I might look through it, looking for cartoons, looking for illustrations, and seeing if within those cartoons I can see an ideological perspective. So analyzing a cartoon is similar to analyzing a quote in the sense that the first step is to look at the cartoon holistically. Big picture, what is it about? Big picture, how does it connect to globalization? Big picture, how does it connect to imperialism and this case study of India? So I might do some of that big picture stuff first. But then within the cartoon, much like I would do within a quote, I would say, what's a problem that the cartoon is presenting to us? What's a challenge, a flaw of globalization that the cartoon is bringing forward? And you may remember that I suggested many times, and you have these notes in your Gandhi video notes that you took, because you guys took great notes, that one of the problems with imperialism in India was that they went from being governed by a British elite to being governed by an Indian elite. That when India decolonized, and you'll want to use as precise language as possible, like words like decolonized, rather than just saying the British walked away, you can say that India was decolonized in 1947. When India is decolonized, then what happens? Then India is left exposed to famine and civil war. So the ideological perspective of this source is that...
Sorry for the interruption. If anyone has Chrome Card 9, could you please contact the office? Thank you.
We have 5. We're good. The ideological perspective of the source might be that a problem was that once India was decolonized, India was just now exploited not by foreign masters, but by a local Indian elite. So you might want to look for that kind of problem. And then what's the solution? Maybe the solution, how do you get rid of elitism? How do you get rid of the Indian oligarchs instead of the British oligarchs that are now controlling India through a caste system? How do you change cultural values? Well, you may start with public education and trying to promote a system of equality. But that system of equality in public education would be limited, its effectiveness, unless they have a democracy where the masses have, by number, more political power than the oligarchs. So potentially the best way to get rid of exploitation long-term in India is to truly embrace democracy and to end up creating politically participating citizens through the education system. So you may have to think critically as to some solutions that you can infer that would get us beyond the problem being exposed by the cartoon. So tomorrow you're going to see a cartoon, tomorrow you're going to see a quote about India. Tomorrow you may see more than one quote. So I do want you to show me that you're paying attention during the Gandhi video. So definitely walk through your Gandhi notes that you took and look at some of the key quotes from Gandhi. Look at some of the key quotes from Gandhi. So if the topic is imperialism, then his quotes will be the ones about colonization. So for example, Gandhi said, "We think it is time that you recognize that you are masters in someone else's home. Despite the best intentions of the best of you, you must, in the nature of things, humiliate us to control us. I beg you to accept that there is no people on earth who would not prefer their own bad government to the good government of an alien power. You may torture my body, break my bones, even kill me. Then you will have my dead body, not my obedience." So there may be a quote like that you'll wrestle with tomorrow that's looking at the idea of colonization and decolonization and Gandhi's vision for a post-imperial India. But for example, moving on to the relationships now, if that was the third source, and if the first source was the one about the knife of sugar, in Gandhi's quote he says, "You may torture my body, break my bones, even kill me. Then you will have my dead body." So when you're trying to create a relationship, the first part of the relationship paragraph needs to be that "to what extent" question. I want to see that as the first sentence in your fourth paragraph. All three sources, when viewed as a set, answer the same question, comma, quotation marks, to what extent was imperialism beneficial in India? Or to what extent was imperialism justified within India? Or to what extent was British imperialism good for India? Something like that. And then you tell me how each source would respond to that, and this is in the 4th paragraph. But there's other, what we call linear relationships. Things that link 2 or more of the sources together. So if we had as a 3rd source that quote that I just read from Gandhi about you may torture my body, break my bones, even kill me, and if we had as one of the other 2 sources the knife of sugar, we can talk about how both of them are using this metaphor as a weapon, that imperialism is a weapon. That's another relationship. So another relationship would be this idea that imperialism is a weapon. In the one, they're saying it's a knife of sugar, and the other one, Gandhi's saying, you can torture me, break my bones, even kill me, but you'll never get my obedience. So Gandhi's suggesting that even though imperialism is a weapon, it's not an effective weapon. Because imperialism is, by definition, control of one people by another. And he's saying, you will never control me. You'll never get my obedience. So, another step to look at in the relationship paragraph would be linear things that link things together. Maybe a common allusion to, in this case, weapons. Or maybe a common allusion to the idea of brutality. Or a common allusion to oligarchs or elites. Or economics. Maybe they're all talking about the economics of imperialism. They're all talking about farming. Indigo. Maybe they're all talking about mercantilism. All 3 weigh in on the British mercantilistic system established in India. So after you have the to what extent holistic question that they all share in common, then we look for other relationships, linear ones that connect 2 or more of them together. Because we know that all 3 tomorrow will be from India, from one case study, another relationship you should be able to establish is chronological. Cause and effect. Which source comes first? Then the second and third. And is one of the sources because the others happened? Do one of the sources show the consequences of the others? Perhaps one of the sources inspired one of the others. So that's another relationship you can look for tomorrow. Is those chronological cause and effect relationships. So the relationship paragraph tomorrow is the one that has the most weighting. It's 30% of the assignment. And it is the toughest part of social studies in high school. Is the relationship paragraph of the A1. Because now you're doing synthetic analytic thinking. It's the highest mental activity you do in any course in high school. And we just went over what you need for tomorrow. Any questions about A1 before we have our math break? Any questions about India? So look over your Gandhi notes. Look over this, lesson 12. Look over the steps of how to do A1. We've spent a lot of time on A1 this quarter so far. Because I want you to be able to leave Social 10 knowing how to do an A1. Because we're not going to have time to continue to teach A1 in grade 11 and 12. So, we're about to have a mask break. And when we get back, we're going to talk about your A2. Alright, go enjoy your mask break.